It started with a secret meeting behind closed doors, never meant for the public. Deep inside the palace, top aides slipped in completely unannounced. Royal diaries were cleared without warning, and a heavy, tense quiet fell over the palace, something even seasoned reporters found deeply unsettling. Then came the statement that shook the nation. What King Charles revealed was far more than a simple update. It threatened to rewrite everything the public believed about the ultimate fate of the British throne. Before we unravel what all of this actually means for the future of the royal family, hit subscribe so you never miss our daily updates. Early on, people shrugged it off as just another minor palace tweak. The sort of private shift the family usually covers up with glossy press releases and tight smiles. But this time things felt cold. Top aides were summoned with frantic urgency, and it was definitely not to plan a celebration. Not for some stiff ceremonial business, but to handle a raw family crisis that had finally spilled out beyond their control. King Charles, according to people close to the royal household, was not just sitting back and listening to reports. He was actively shaping the final statement, agonizing over every single word, knowing that once these words escaped into the open air, there was no taking them back. The rumour mill ignited almost instantly. Some whispered it was about his sons, others believed it directly decided the future roles of William and Catherine. A few feared it was far more painful, that the ageing king, worn down by years of relentless pressure and the looming shadow of his legacy, was finally presenting demands he had kept buried under duty. Palace staff tried to downplay the gossip, but their nervous silence only made the mystery feel much deeper. Plans shifted, conversations grew tense, trusted voices went silent, and when the official news finally hit, it felt like a heavily sealed, historic royal decree being torn open right in front of the public. King Charles had crossed a line most rulers never touch. He allowed raw private family desires to bleed directly into the public legacy of the throne. To some it seemed deeply human, to others it felt incredibly reckless. Because once a monarch exposes what he truly desires behind those high walls, the entire nation starts questioning what this means for the throne, for Prince William's looming future, for Catherine's place at his side, and for the incredibly fragile peace holding the House of Windsor together. But that shocking statement was merely the start, because its real origins reach back through years of secret desires Charles kept fiercely guarded. For years, King Charles kept a strict line between public duty and his personal hopes, but the people closest to him understood there were deeply private desires he rarely spoke about. Now, for the very first time, pieces of those hidden plans were slowly slipping out, bringing along massive consequences that nobody saw coming. To the public, King Charles was always supposed to represent stability, the person who inherited not just a golden crown, but the heavy burden of keeping centuries of sacred royal tradition perfectly intact. Yet beneath that royal duty was a real father who survived brutal family feuds, agonizing estrangements, relentless press attacks, and the quiet shattering of ties he once thought would last forever. Inside sources claim that King Charles had spent years worrying about the state of his family after his passing. Not just about who gets what title, but about real family loyalty, genuine forgiveness, and basic survival. He knew the throne could survive public scandal, they had done it before. What he truly feared, according to palace whispers, was something far worse, a family so deeply fractured that even the crown could no longer hide the cracks. That is why his hidden wishes mattered so much. These were not just minor, fleeting hopes written on the margins of his royal life. They were reportedly tied directly to the core survival, to his legacy and the ultimate future shape of the House of Windsor. Senior family members had reportedly been part of quiet, heavy conversations over the years, tense talks that touched on ancient wounds, heavy future duties, and the agonizing question of who could actually be trusted to defend the crown when King Charles could no longer keep the family together. Historic tradition hung heavy over every decision. Queen Elizabeth's long reign still cast a deep, quiet shadow over the entire palace, reminding them all that private feelings should never be allowed to dilute public duty. But King Charles was not his mother. He was far more emotional, highly reflective, and visibly shaped by deep regrets. That made his ultimate choices both raw and risky. As public pressure mounted around the fragile monarchy, keeping those deeply personal desires a secret became almost impossible. Every cold family feud, every unexplained public absence, and every dry palace press release seemed to force him closer to a choice he had put off for decades. And when those long-buried desires finally started to emerge, it did not feel like some soft, quiet confession. It felt like forcing open a locked vault, suddenly spilling out a lifetime of love, fear, and unresolved family trauma, and fallout that could spill way past the palace walls. As details leaked, people asked the same question. Why lay bare these private desires now, after years of silence in the palace? Timing is absolutely everything. Every stiff nod, every brief statement, and every heavy silence means something. That is why Charles choosing to break his silence right now rattled the entire country. This timing felt intensely deliberate, maybe even desperate. For months, the family had stood under a harsh, much heavier spotlight. While those uncomfortable questions about their future grew louder, sharper, and impossible to dodge, Charles knew keeping quiet could shield the throne for only so long before that silence became its own confession. Wait too long and someone else writes the entire history of your reign. Reports suggest the king understood this terrifying risk with brutal clarity. He spent his whole life waiting to be king, only to take the crown when his own family was completely falling apart. People were getting restless, and the younger generation was already being measured up against him. So this move was never just about private feelings. It was about taking back control of the narrative and the legacy. He wanted to shape the final message tied to his name before history handed down its final verdict. Behind palace doors, succession was no longer some abstract theory discussed in polite, dusty legal terms. It had become raw, practical, and deeply personal. Every single choice Charles made now pointed to one uncomfortable truth. The crown faced a massive, scary shift, and he refused to let cheap gossip, old grudges, or bitter family feuds define this era. People were growing incredibly worried about his failing health and stamina. They wondered if the House of Windsor could ever survive another exhausting era of intense strain. Those deep, painful family wounds had definitely not healed. Crushing pressures on William only grew worse. Catherine's quiet, steady strength had become their ultimate anchor. Behind her stood Charles, torn between his heavy crown and the deep ache of a father who knew some family wounds would never fully heal. That was why the timing felt so incredibly explosive. By laying out his wishes now, Charles drew a firm line before events could spin out of control. Some called it brave. Others took it as a threat, but nobody could deny this was a massive defining moment for the crown. The kind that does not start with a loud bang, but with quiet, deliberate words that instantly freeze the air inside a massive institution. As those words echoed across the entire country, a chilling realization settled over everyone watching the palace. This was not just a passing comment. It was a clear signal that the crown's private bleeding heart had stepped onto the public stage. Once that happened, every single relationship in the family would be dragged into the storm. But looking closer, it was obvious this was not just about Charles. This choice was dragging the entire royal family down with him. Inside the palace, chaos erupted instantly. Some insiders welcomed his raw honesty, while others were left completely blindsided and deeply rattled. As the public loudly argued over what his words meant, quiet, desperate conversations were happening behind closed doors with massive consequences. For Prince William, this carried a heavy, exhausting burden that no outsider could ever truly understand. This was not just his dad speaking. It was the ruling king forcing highly private family struggles into the cold light of duty and inheritance, all while reshaping the future of the crown. Word is, William kept his response extremely controlled, fully aware of how explosive this could get. He knew public sympathy for his father could easily turn into aggressive gossip about his own succession, and that gossip meant intense pressure. Catherine stepping up during this family crisis was once again seen as their vital, quiet stabiliser, the only one who could absorb the emotional blow without stripping away the sheer weight of the king's message. She did not shout, but she mattered, in a family where even a quiet pause means war staying steady is real power. Meanwhile, other senior royals started dissecting the statement from every angle. Some saw a deeply personal confession from a tired man carrying too many heavy burdens. Others panicked desperately, fearing the public would misinterpret this move as weakness, or worse proof that messy family dramas were starting to overtake their solemn duty to the crown. That growing panic sent aides scrambling. Statements required constant scanning. Official briefings had to be tightly locked down. Every word repeated on the news carried massive risk. The palace knew a single wrong interpretation would instantly trigger a much larger, uglier scandal. Behind closed doors, tense family calls intensified. Old, bitter grudges were not erased by Charles's raw honesty. In some ways, those lines became pretty hard to ignore. Who made the cut in his wishes, and who was left completely out? Who would really benefit from this emotional shift in the royal family? And who might find themselves feeling completely exposed? These whispers travelled quietly through royal circles, but their real impact was anything but quiet. The statement drew a whole new map of alliances inside the House of Windsor, with William standing much closer to the very centre. Catherine was acting as the calm, steady hand right beside him, while senior officials measured how much of Charles's private hope could safely become part of their public future. What made the whole situation so incredibly tense was not just what Charles said, it was what he left completely unsaid. In the royal family, silence can wound just as sharply as words, and those omissions were now being analysed with intense scrutiny. But if certain family members were left in shock, others seemed to recognise something far more serious hidden deep beneath Charles's words. At its core, this whole statement raised a question much bigger than any one royal. It forced Britain to face a very uncomfortable truth. What kind of legacy does a king actually leave behind when public duty and family collide? For Charles, that question was never going to be simple. His whole life had been shaped by decades of waiting, preparing, and carrying a heavy burden that belonged to him long before he ever wore the crown. He had spent decades learning that a monarchy is never built on personal happiness alone. It is built on sacrifice, strict restraint, and the painful art of putting the institution far before yourself. Yet now, in this incredibly fragile chapter, his personal desires had stepped right into the same arena as his public duty, making this fragile moment feel deeply human and yet dangerously historic. Reports suggest that insiders close to the palace saw this not as some sudden emotional confession, but as the inevitable explosion of pressure building up behind those heavy palace gates. Charles desperately wanted unity. He wanted dignity. He wanted the family he inherited and the one he would eventually leave behind to survive without tearing themselves apart on the world stage. But wanting peace and actually securing it are two very different things. British history is filled with rulers who learned that brutal lesson way too late. Rulers who believed family disputes could be easily contained until they became massive national dramas. That very shadow now hung over Charles's announcement. Some members of the public naturally viewed his words with deep sympathy, seeing a king trying to protect those he loved while still fully honouring his duty to the crown. Others were far less forgiving, asking whether any monarch should ever allow personal hopes to influence the future direction of an institution that ultimately belongs to the entire nation. That division made the announcement even more powerful. This was definitely not just some simple royal update. It became a clear mirror reflecting exactly how people view the monarchy itself. Is the crown just a messy family story filled with wounds, loyalty, and forgiveness? Or is it a sacred duty that must remain above personal desire, no matter the painful cost? Charles had lived torn between those two worlds for decades, but right now the distance between them felt smaller than ever before. Every word he chose carried the heavy weight of what he truly wanted remembered. Not just the grand ceremonies, the empty titles, or the public acts of service. but the raw emotional truth of a reign shaped by immense responsibility and quiet regret. And as the debate quickly spread from royal commentators to ordinary households, one key point became absolutely impossible to ignore. His legacy was no longer something waiting safely at the very end of Charles's reign. It was being actively written in real-time, sentence by sentence, decision by decision, silence by silence. And the more the entire nation questioned what Charles actually meant, the more attention naturally shifted toward the heir, who would one day inherit not just the throne, but every single unresolved consequence attached to it. As debate intensified across the country, public attention shifted directly toward the person most likely to carry that heavy legacy forward. For Prince William, this historic announcement created an entirely new, challenging reality. Suddenly, intense conversations that once belonged safely to the future felt very present. Expectations grew much heavier, responsibilities even larger, and the path ahead more complicated than ever before. William had always known that one day the crown would inevitably come closer. But there is a massive difference between knowing a duty exists and feeling it begin to tighten around every single part of your life. Charles's words did not simply remind the public of William's future. They seemed to aggressively pull that future right into the present, forcing the public to look at him not only as a son, but as the man who would eventually inherit the unfinished story his father was still writing today. Reports suggest that intense public scrutiny around William increased almost immediately, with every single decision measured against the larger question of whether he could safely carry the monarchy through a highly uncertain age. The next generation was no longer a distant promise, it was rapidly becoming the emotional centre of the entire national conversation. William was now bound to the private desires of Charles, a delicate, heavy and dangerous position. If Charles demanded unity, William had to protect it. If Charles wanted dignity, William would be judged on preserving it. And if the king's words exposed old fractures, it fell on William to keep those deep cracks from splintering under the pressure. Catherine's presence right beside him became absolutely crucial as the public pressure began to mount. She was the calm inside the media storm, the discipline cutting through the wild rumours, and the quiet backbone a shaking royal institution desperately needed. Palace insiders rarely call her influence loud or aggressive. Instead, she is a rock keeping everyone grounded in the exact moments that send others into a tailspin. Standing together, William and Catherine seemed to represent the exact future that a desperate public wanted to believe in. They were modern enough to feel real pain, traditional enough to honour royal duty, and wise enough to know the crown survives on public trust, not just raw emotion. But preparing to take the throne is never a clean path. It is filled with grief, painful family tension, endless public comparison, and the dark reality that their rise means a father's life is drawing closer to its final curtain. That deep emotional friction gave the statement its true stinging power. Charles was speaking from the very middle of a reign, still in progress, yet the entire country was already dissecting the shape of the crown that would follow. And in that silent gap between a father and his son, between private desires and heavy public duty, William was standing right at a massive crossroads, one that would shape his own life and decide whether the royal institution itself can even survive. But even as all eyes turned to William, a final quiet detail threatened to completely rewrite how history remembers this entire broadcast. Just as observers thought they understood the story, another quiet detail slipped out. It started quite small, a tiny clarification, a quick piece of context, but it completely flipped the true meaning of everything King Charles had just declared. Suddenly the king's message felt far more critical than anyone had first assumed. What initially sounded like a highly personal confession was starting to look like a calculated royal warning, precisely timed and very deliberately placed for its maximum possible impact. New reports suggest this detail revealed how Charles framed his wishes, presenting them not just as soft hopes for peace, but as strict rules for how the family must behave going forward. That shift changed everything. A personal wish is soft, but royal guidance quickly becomes a heavy expectation, and inside the palace, expectations harden into crushing pressure. Media commentators immediately began tearing the king's statement apart line by line, demanding to know why specific words were chosen, why others were totally ignored, and why the palace allowed a deeply private family drama to carry such massive public weight. The closer the press looked, the more this royal scandal seemed to explode. Palace insiders tried to calm the waters, hinting that Charles was merely trying to shield the crown from future wars by making his final wishes completely undeniable right now. But that only sparked an even sharper, darker question: protected from whom and from what? Public outrage and concern grew rapidly as people stopped viewing the king's message as a simple olive branch, seeing it instead as a direct threat about the bitter feuds still raging behind palace doors. Some felt deep pity for a sick king trying to manage a broken family. Many others worried his words put an unfair, impossible burden on William and Catherine and their young children, forcing them to inherit not just a heavy golden crown, but all the toxic family trauma Charles failed to resolve during his own life. Debate over his real motives turned incredibly fierce. Was this a desperate act of love, a final bid for peace, or a hard boundary drawn before the monarchy changes hands? Or was it, as some quietly whispered, a calculated leak designed to prepare the public for much harder decisions still to come? This agonizing doubt is what gave the event its grip. The palace refused to deny the emotional shock of the news, yet they completely refused to explain it either. In that silent void of information, wild public speculation absolutely exploded. Every single word was treated like legal evidence, every silence felt deeply suspicious, and every glance became a puzzle piece. Charles opened a door kings usually keep locked tight, and now the country was staring straight inside, trying to tell if they had witnessed a father's raw vulnerability or a calculated strategic warning from a king. That answer remains deeply hidden, but the toxic fallout is already ripping through the House of Windsor like a Category 5 hurricane, which now brings us to the single most vital question of this entire royal drama. What actually happens when a king broadcasts his deepest, most private wishes to an entire nation? Most royal decrees are forgotten in days. Others become massive historic turning points that completely redefine an entire era. As the public digested the king's heavy words, many realized this broadcast belongs in that second, far more dangerous category. This emotional shockwave will not fade just because the news cycle moves on. It sank deep into the public gossip mills, heavy in the palace air, blurring that fragile line between the monarchy as a family and the monarchy as a business. Charles did not just share a private desire, he forced the entire nation to question what it really expects from its king when his heart and his crown start to tangle together. Insiders claim this shocking announcement drew a sharp line in the sand behind closed palace doors, a tense turning point where every move gets weighed against their legacy. Will the royals pull together, or will old bitter feuds only harden under the mounting pressure? Will the public see compassion or total weakness? Would William and Catherine inherit a peaceful reign or a storm made worse by decades of unresolved family drama? These questions did not fade away. Instead, they grew louder. People began looking at the royals not as some distant symbol, but as a fragile human group carrying centuries of grief, secret sacrifice, and heavy silence. That was the real power behind Charles's words. They made the crown seem incredibly grand but desperately fragile all at once. Still, the future waits for no one. This historic institution still faces relentless public scrutiny, bitter family wars, generational shifts, and the endless pressure to justify its existence today. William and Catherine stand right at the edge of their next chapter, not because the present is over, but because Charles's sudden revelation makes the future completely impossible to ignore. Their calm response, their private choices, and their grip on public trust will decide if this crisis becomes a permanent scar or a healing bridge. As for Charles, these personal wishes might become the single most emotional piece of his legacy, not the loudest. nor the most ceremonial, but easily the most revealing. They showed a vulnerable king desperately trying to shield what he loves while carrying a heavy duty he can never escape. While the nation is left wondering what comes next, one single truth becomes absolutely clear. Royal history is not just shaped by heavy crowns, castles, and formal royal declarations. It is carved by the secret desires that finally bubble to the surface and by the brave individuals strong enough to bear those consequences. Because long after the drama fades and the public debates quiet down, a ruler's true measure is not what he inherits, but what he chooses to leave behind. Thank you for watching. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and we will see you in the very next video.